Welcome to the virtual panel COP26, A Decade to Deliver. Welcome from me, Nick Gowing. I'm founder and co-director of Thinking the Unthinkable. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the globe. Welcome to the second webinar from the Climate Action Roadmap to COP26, the digital event series. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Here are the issues we want to look at in the next hour and a quarter. A decade to deliver, the impact of the pandemic on climate and environmental diplomacy, how to maintain momentum through 2020, critical issues for COP to be a success, the role of private sector, NGOs and civil society groups at COP, and linking economic recovery to the SDGs to build back better. So remember those, please, for the next hour and a quarter. Who do we have with us? In a moment, we're going to hear from Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and Chair of the Elders. We have Raffaele Mauro Petriccione, Director General for Climate Action from the European Commission. He's joining us from Brussels. Nigel Topping, UK High-Level Climate Action Champion for COP26. He's joining us from the southwest of England. And Chris Stark, who's Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, joining us from Glasgow in Scotland. Welcome to you all. Now, we're going to be asking all of you out there, and there are 2,800 of you, to start putting questions right from the get-go from now, because we're going to be putting questions to each of them as we go through this hour and a quarter. So don't back-end load what your questions are. Put them up there immediately now, and I'm going to tell you how to do that. Let's change the slide. These are the instructions stroke encouragement for you. We'd like you to start your question with what organization you represent, if you can, followed by your name and who you would like the question to be put to. That'll help me. And go to the control panel, the Q&A control panel at the bottom of your screen. Let's hear what organization or country you're from and what speaker the question is for. You can go on Twitter to hashtag Climate Action Live, and you can follow at climate_action. So do please help me by directing to a specific speaker if you can, or alternatively, all. Now, climate action. This is about joining a conversation established in 2007. We're about creating digital and live platforms to build stronger partnerships between business, government, and the NGO community to accelerate international sustainable development and to advance the Paris Agreement. And over 12 years, there's been a global event portfolio developed, digital media platforms as well, on which stakeholders and partners can share knowledge, solutions, and expertise. And that's very much what today is about, sharing knowledge, solutions, and expertise, practical solutions as well to the challenges on climate change. There's over 12 years experience dealing with key stakeholders here at Climate Action. Obviously, there's a process underway. Here it is, COP26 in the extreme right. I'll be asking Nigel when that is going to happen, as he maybe has the answer. We would like to hear as well from you what you think the prospects are as we move from COP16 right up to COP26. But this is about you and your company, your institution getting involved in the series. So please do see this as part of a community. Get in touch with Climate Action to find out how you can be involved. And let me reassure you, the 11th edition of the Sustainable Innovation Forum will go ahead to coincide with COP26. It's never been more important really to get organizations moving together, talking together, exchanging understandings, and also the challenges and your concerns about which direction things are going in. Now, a bit of housekeeping here. This is a virtual panel. You need to know it is being recorded, and the recording will be available to watch on demand. You'll get the recording within 24 hours. Do engage with us, voice your opinion. Let's hear your questions. And there will be a poll question from each speaker at the end of their 4 minutes of remarks. And do please help us by completing an external survey after the virtual panel. And finally, do subscribe, go to climateaction.org. Keep in touch with the whole series of events and gatherings like this, which we're going to be building over the next few months. So that's how we're running it for the next hour and a quarter. Let me introduce our first panelist, Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and Chair of the Elders, who is joining us now from Dublin. Welcome, Mary. And we would like you to use your time to set the agenda. And let me just, if I may, show you and show our viewers the book, Climate Justice, which you brought out last year, which is a very personal reflection. You've been involved in the United Nations for so long, but this is a very personal reflection, including the birth of your grandson, Rory. And you realized then that climate change was so important. And as you say, at that point, you were a late adopter of the climate change principle. Mary, welcome. The floor is yours for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, and I'm delighted to take part. Let me go back to January of this year. I could go back further and talk about becoming more and more urgent about the fact that we needed to address the issues of climate. Last January, I was virtually in despair. We were at the start of 2020, the year when the countries had to dramatically increase their ambition. We had to see more ambition for business as well. And we really weren't seeing that kind of leadership. We were looking forward to COP26 in Glasgow in November, and we were not seeing the change that I was looking for. And then COVID-19 hit, and hit very hard. Now, COVID-19 is very destructive. It has exacerbated the inequalities in our world. It's not a great leveler. It's actually showing us that our world is both very unequal, very uneven, and it's bringing out the intersectionality. I'm using that word intersectionality because I'm the only woman on this panel. It's a great feminist word. The intersectionality between poverty, race, gender, marginalization, being a refugee, being an indigenous person, being a person with disability. It's all worse. For the poor old informal worker who has to work every day for food, where's the food? For the woman locked down in an abusive household, the level of domestic violence and violence against children is increasing. For the girls dropped out of school, early child marriage, and so on. So at the same time, in a wonderful way, COVID-19 is teaching us some very interesting lessons. First of all, that human behavior matters now, because we're collectively the only thing between us and the virus getting much worse. We're doing this to protect the more vulnerable, the older people like myself, but also health workers, care workers in homes. And we sort of have a sense of empowerment in that, which is relevant later to the climate issue. Science matters. We're listening to the health experts. They're advising government. And if governments don't take that advice, we will see when we look back that the governments that didn't follow the health advice did badly and caused more deaths. And that will be a very raw, very tough judgment pretty soon, I think, on countries. Thirdly, the idea of compassion matters. We're seeing neighborliness all around the world now. We're seeing people kind of showing that they care more about those worse off than themselves. That wasn't the case with the climate issue. We had many deaths from climate around the world, more deaths than COVID has produced. And yet people didn't care because it was the other. It was too far away. It was small island states, it was indigenous peoples in countries, it was very poor countries. Yes, it was Australia, the first world country to have a huge problem with the fires last summer. But by and large, we weren't empathizing. Now I think we've more capacity to empathize. And so I hope as we come out of COVID-19, we do so without thinking we're coming out, period. No, we have to do it in sync. We have to come out of COVID-19 in a way that will address all the issues of the climate crisis, which is still there, still looming, still urgent. And therefore, I think we need to not just build back better, but do it much more consciously green, but also much more consciously just transition, and transition for those countries that need basic supports for themselves, like health systems that are strengthened, education systems. And at the end of the day, as you know, Nick, I'm a human rights person. I think COVID-19 has exposed the fact that we're not upholding human rights globally around the world when we have such inequalities and injustices that have been exacerbated and exposed by COVID-19. We must remember that this is the 75th year of the UN. We should have much more global solidarity, much more sense of our humanity and of the rights that we have and have promised ourselves since the Universal Declaration, and that you know, somehow we're at home now, a lot of us thinking more, and we should be thinking as a human race how we can do better.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. Mary, you've now got I'd like to encourage people to keep putting the questions. I've already got 3 or 4 to ask you immediately, but you've also got a question which you'd like to put to those who are watching, the 2,800 out there. Would you like to just give it, and also with the options that they have to give us their view of your question at this point?
Okay, well, my question is, how far do you agree with the statement, inequalities exposed by the coronavirus crisis are inequalities that the climate crisis compounds? 1, strongly agree. 2, somewhat agree. 3, somewhat disagree. 4, strongly disagree.
Thanks, Mary. So please, if you're out there, do give us your view, and we'll come back to Mary in 4 or 5 minutes at the end of a few questions to hear what you're thinking. And I will now, Mary, if I may, you're in Dublin. One of the best questions immediately is picking up on something you've just said from Adam Boland, who's in Dublin City. I don't think this is a plant here. Do you think that male leaders are less likely to take radical climate action than female leaders? And if so, why would that be?
Well, I think it is interesting, and it has been noted, that countries that have been led by women are doing better overall. I'm thinking of Angela Merkel in Germany, the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland in Europe, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the woman president in Taiwan. I think it's because these women have led in a way that takes seriously the science, listens to it, cares about the fact that tough decisions have to be taken, but it's better to take them in order to safeguard the real rights and welfare of your people. And it is quite noticeable, I think.
But help us understand, you were a president of the Republic of Ireland. What is it about women who can take tougher decisions, be bolder? Even Jacinda Ardern in her pajamas looking after her new child and talking about the problem. Is there something about relating to the public as much as anything else?
I think it's an instinct for problem solving, an instinct that you don't know all the answers, and therefore you're more willing to listen to the science and learn. When I'm with other women heads of state or government or presidents or former presidents, I'm actually often surprised at how often we ask, we confess, that we didn't do things as well as we might, and could we do better? And I think that's a strength.
So men have got to be more humble as well, is that?
In a way, yes, and less hierarchical. Now, there are men who are like this, and there are women who are not very problem solving and who can be worse. We don't need to, it's not all women. But I think there is a women's way of leading, which is helping.
All right, well, that'll come out. I'm sorry, the numbers are overloaded with too many men, but you've made very important points there, and you made it yourself. And we've had that particular question. Let's move on to Akshay from India, from ISEC. How will the integrated approach towards the SDGs overcome the shortcomings of COP25 in Madrid?
I think that's a very good question, because we do need to keep the SDGs front and center in our Build Back Better. And we need now to recognize the problem for developing countries. It's always been a problem. The problem is that they have to basically grow without emissions and get as much green energy as possible. So they need the investment, they need the technology, they need the skills. And we haven't been as helpful in getting that to them. And now, because of the crisis of COVID, the commodities prices have fallen. The money has moved back to the rich countries. Capital has fled from developing countries, and they have a huge debt. So they need debt forgiveness. I hope that the G20 and the G20 finance ministers are meeting on the 19th, and the G20 leaders afterwards will have a very big debt relief linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. That countries get that relief if they commit to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that would be really helpful.
Keep your questions coming, please. Build Back Better. How to relate that to the COP process? Slogans, particularly during the COVID crisis, have been critical to getting the public on side and getting them to understand. Is Build Back Better the right one? Is there a better one out there for you?
I'm not sure. I'm not the best at the slogans, but I think it's a kind of curious thing we got to do in working towards COP26. we have to understand that we have an immediate crisis, but we also have the looming crisis, and dealing with them both must be in a somewhat similar way, but phased. The first phase has to be to deal with the COVID-19 crisis itself, try to come out of that in a staged way as countries are doing, but make sure that all of the incentives for then moving the economy back are green and are investing. The 6 actions that the Secretary General called for would be a really good response.
Final thought at this stage, if I can, another question, Mary. How much do you fear that actually the worries, the existential worries over the epidemiological threat to all of us, the human beings on this planet, that in many ways, despite the priority on climate change, is going to dominate, and people will not really realize how this is really a dry run for the climate change crisis?
I think that people do recognize that this will pass. It's very worrying and it has been very destabilizing. The mental health issues are very real for people, but there is a sense that we will come out of this. It will not be easy and we will not be in the same place. But then the same place wasn't going to be good anyway. Business as usual wasn't going to get us to address the climate crisis. So somehow I think we have to have a lot of hope for young people in particular, because their lives have been very affected. I feel very strongly, the elders actually have focused on the intergenerational dialogue. On our website, theelders.org, we have the stories of young people from around the world, from China, from Uganda, from various parts of the world, talking about their hopes from a climate context of overcoming COVID-19 and moving to a better world.
Thank you, Mary, for the moment. Let's just look at what the outcome is of the poll. Stay with us, of course, because we're going to come back to you shortly with all the other speakers. Can we have those results up? Here we go. It's disappeared. Here we are. The question, inequalities exposed by the coronavirus crisis are inequalities that the climate crisis compounds. Do you agree? 65%, 2/3 of those who voted strongly agree. Somewhat agree, 31%, almost no disagreement apart from 4%, Mary. So your question has really produced an outcome which is about 96% that inequalities exposed by the coronavirus are inequalities that the climate crisis compounds. Many thanks for that question. So stay with us because we're coming back. There are a lot of other questions coming in at the moment. Let's move on to Brussels, if we can, to Raffaele Mauro Petriccione. Mauro, you would like to be referred to as Mauro, the Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. You have 4 minutes, Mauro, and then we'll follow up with other questions as well. And please, for all of those out there, please keep your questions coming in. And Mauro as well has another question for you at the end of his remarks. Mauro, the floor is yours.
Nick, many thanks, and many thanks for the invitation to this panel. Look, let me start where Mary Robinson left at the end of the presentation. Climate change did not go away because we have a health crisis, and it will not go away. It will be there when we have found a solution to this crisis, which we will. And if we have lost time in the meantime, that's not time we can make up. Now, the real issue is what do we do now? It's very clear everybody's focus is going to be on repairing our economy and restarting it and trying to avoid that the economic damage that this crisis will do compounds enormously the damage already done in terms of livelihoods and human lives that the health crisis is still causing. Now, rev back a little bit to the end of last year, when we were saying that we knew what kind of transformation we need, we knew what we need to do, we were hampered by the fact that the status quo for too many was too comfortable to really engage in that deep transformation, and we didn't know where to find the massive resources to invest in the transformation, because we're talking about investment and not straight cost. Now look at where we are now. The status quo is not that comfortable anymore, very uncomfortable as a matter of fact. And in order to restart and recover our economy, we will have to invest massively into it. So both the opportunity and the resources will be there and we should use them. Now, 2 more points. We're not posing in Europe in that direction. We will have debate. It is going to be difficult, but we are not posing in pursuing a climate agenda and in marrying it to what we now call the green recovery, the green and digital recovery, to use the term of President von der Leyen. Now, we are often asked to make the case for why should recovery be green. To me, what puzzles me is that I'd like to know what case there is to make a recovery as business as usual. My last point is, what is the role of COP26 in all this? And are we posing on that as well? I must say, I understand the reason why the UK government postponing. For us, and we've been very clear in public on this, there are two conditions for the next COP. One, it's a COP about ambition, and the other one, it has inclusive participation of everybody. Now, I think it's fair to say that assuring both those objectives at the end of this year is going to be very challenging. So we understand the decision to postpone, and when consulted on how should we proceed towards COP26, we've insisted on these two components. We must make sure that it is a COP that produces greater ambitions in terms of transformation, and we must make sure that it is inclusive in its participation. And right now, that's very difficult. This crisis isn't over, and it hasn't hit everybody in the same manner, and we don't know for how long it's going to continue. So taking our time to organize the COP at a time when we can make it really productive is not a bad idea.
Thank you, Mauro. You have a question as well, which you'd like to put to all those watching us at the moment for them to give an answer.
Well, in many ways, I've anticipated it. Can really one make the case that repairing our economy after COVID-19 or as a fossil fuels-based economy is better than rebuilding as a clean and modern one? As a colleague of mine put it, it's not a question of bouncing back, it's a question of bouncing forward.
And indeed, thank you, Mauro. There you can see it's a very simple choice, yes or no. And certainly if you do think there's a case for rebuilding as a fuel, as a fossil fuels-based economy, then we'd like to hear from you maybe, and that'll enrich the discussion which is coming up. Mauro, thank you very much indeed. I've got a couple of questions immediately for you. First of all, from Rachid Enassiri, who's founder of the Moroccan Youth Center for Sustainable Energy in Morocco. Countries focusing on implementation of the current NDCs with the risk of lock-in and not on longer-term ambition raising and associated benefits. Is that confirmed? How do you deal with this? Countries focusing on the implementation of the current NDCs?
It is a natural temptation. You know, it doesn't happen only in some countries, it happens everywhere. You have an objective, it's a challenging one, and those NDCs, insufficient as they are collectively, they are individually challenging for all countries. And you focus on that challenge. I think we have to learn that this is a process. A decade to deliver, but to deliver what? We have a decade to deliver the start of this process, to make the investment, to deploy the technologies, to start the research. But it's a process that for Europe will last 30 years. For other countries will last longer. But if you look at the science tells us that if we start now and if we put our effort over the next decade, by the end of this, by the middle of the century, we will be on our way to abating climate change. So it is difficult, but we have to learn to do many things at the same time. Implement what we have already decided. Look at increasing the ambition as we are implementing it, and look at what our final objective is. That's what we're trying to do in Europe. We have an NDC, we have a minus 40% objective. We're now looking at raising it to 50 or 55%, and we've given ourselves the long-term objective of climate neutrality in 2050. And I can tell you, for Europe, developed as it is, it's a very challenging exercise. It will be the same for everybody, but we don't think we have any other choice. That's the only way to go.
Here's a question from Sophie Meres. Even with the COVID-19 recession, as she puts it, we are not seeing as much reduction on greenhouse gases as we thought we would. So how are we to reach our targets if this is what is happening with this incredible deceleration of economic activity?
Well, it depends on where you are, it depends what your situation is. If you look at Europe in 2019, and the figures just came out, we had our best year of economic growth for a while, 1.4, which, okay, it's not flabbergasting by world standard, but by our standards, not too bad. And we reduce our emissions in the areas covered by the emission trading system by almost 9%. And it was one of our best performance in recent years. So you can do these things, and we are on track, and we want to stay on track. The issue for Europe is how to accelerate that and how to avoid that we see to the temptation of back to business as usual and therefore pause on that track. Worldwide, no, we're not in that situation, and that's what we have to concentrate on.
But what about the real tension between the following: the need for the European Union to generate new economic activity, greener, tilted economic activity, at the same time as you've got the Green Deal? Is there a conflict here between regenerating economic activity to regenerate at least cash flow and the imperatives of the Green Deal? How are you trying to resolve that now in Brussels? Do you have yet a very clear possibility for that?
I don't think there's any contradiction. On the contrary, the question, as I said earlier, is you need a lot of investment to start these processes. Now we will be forced to find those resources for investing. And as President von der Leyen said, we're going to borrow those resources from future generations. The least we can do is to invest in things those generations need. I'll give you one example which we are fast forwarding in terms of our plan for the Green Deal, what we will call the renovation wave. Renovating buildings is fundamental to energy efficiency and to abating emissions. It's a huge generator of emissions. We have the resources, we have the materials, we have the technologies. If we manage to accelerate that, the construction industry is one of the most local ones. That means.
What about the countries which are dragging their feet, like Poland? You know, you are not facing. You've got increasing disunity within the European Union at the moment.
I think you should look at what people do, not what people say when they are discussing how much money everybody gets. If you look at what Poland is doing rather well in terms of abating emissions. Thank you very much. They're modernizing their economy, they're doing well, and yes, they preach prudence, but there is an issue of intra-EU solidarity, which has always been with us and will always be with us. When at the same time you debate a 7 years budget, you can expect this kind of discussion to get to be rough. But I don't think Poland is falling behind.
All right, final quick question, if I can, Mauro, from Kate Young from the Aldersgate Group. Can I ask you how important you think it is for the European Commission to raise its ambition for the 2030 climate target well ahead of COP26? In other words, go beyond the Green Deal.
I think the Green Deal is an increase in our ambition. We are talking about moving from 40 to 50 or 55%, which puts us on a straight line towards climate neutrality in 2050. And we have already made our view clear. Now we are working to demonstrate that it is economically possible. And we are on track to demonstrate that as well.
Okay, Mauro, let's see what the answer is to the question you put at the end of your remarks. Let's see that, please. Is there a case that repairing our economy after COVID-19 as a fossil fuels-based economy is better than rebuilding as a clean and modern one? 90% say no, but there are 11%, Mauro, who say yes, there is a case. What would you quickly say to them?
I would be worried if we had 100% no. I don't believe in unanimity. Debate is a good thing, but I'm comforted to see that, yes, let that 10% make their case. We'll meet that case and we'll dismantle it.
All right, well, let me encourage anyone out there to send us a message saying, I'm one of the 11% who voted yes. I'll explain why I believe. So Mauro can hear the answer to that, and also so can the other speakers as well. Mauro, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. Let's move on now to Nigel
Thank
Topping,
you.
who is the UK high-level climate action champion for COP26. There is Nigel. He's joining us from Devon. And Nigel, you will have a question as well, but you've got 4 minutes, and we do have a lot of questions for you as well. You know what one of them is. Nigel Topping, go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. And it's great to follow Mary and Mauro. I want to start by saying that I am convinced that the race to the zero carbon economy has already started. So I would, Mauro talks about starting now. It started a long time ago. And it started because of two reasons. One is the science. And every time the scientists look at the challenge of climate change, the climate crisis, their assessment of risk goes up. So if you track the reports from the IPCC, that's been a consistent trend. For the same degree of warming, their assessment of the level of risk has only gone up every time. And now with a delay in the COP26 to next year, the next report, the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, some of that work at least will fall likely before the COP. So I think that will only heighten the scientific case for urgency. But the other reason I say the race to zero has already started is competitiveness. And I want to talk a little bit about why companies and countries are increasingly committing, not just for climate reasons, but for economic reasons, to the inevitable transition to a zero carbon economy. But just to give you some sense of how fast this is changing, the IPCC's report on 1.5 degrees came out in October 2018. And until then, very few companies, cities, businesses and investors, and that's the community I work with as a high-level champion, had committed to net zero. In the summer last year, some of those commitments started to emerge at the Secretary General's Summit in September. There were a few hundred, and between September and December, the number doubled. So we had more than double the number of businesses, cities, investors. So like 800 businesses, $5 trillion worth of assets under management, and hundreds of cities. And that's continuing to increase. And on World Environment Day on the 5th of June, so in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, we'll be launching the Race to Zero campaign, which will run all the way to COP26, and expect to see hundreds more cities, investors, businesses and states and regions join that. In fact, we've set ourselves a target of getting 10 times as many to join, and I think we might do much better than that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that this is, we're not starting from standstill. Second is just to reiterate what's been said, I think, already about the links between COVID and climate. You know, 7 million people die every year of respiratory diseases because of air pollution caused by the same sources of pollution as are causing global warming. So we have a chronic, long-term health crisis, orders of magnitude worse than the COVID crisis, that we have to tackle. And that's before you get the economic damage and the human damage as a result of increasing and more severe extreme weather events. The other thing, of course, that they have in common is jobs. You know, we have millions more jobs, and much better macroeconomic conditions will be created. We know this from the work of the IPCC, the Stern Review, the New Climate Economy Report, as a result of tackling climate change. Those benefits of tackling climate change don't go away. And the final point I wanted to make about the parallels between COVID and climate is how COVID has really brought into sharp relief the need for us to think more seriously about what resilience means and how we build resilient economies, resilient societies. And remember, Mark Carney, who has recently stepped down as governor of the Bank of England, was also in that role, chair of the G20's Financial Stability Board, and he made the very strong case, which has led to a real sea change in the thinking in the finance sector, that climate change represents a destabilizing force in global financial markets and economies. So tackling climate change really, in and of itself, makes our economies and our societies more resilient. And we're seeing now very loud voices from the business community, from the investor community, from the cities community, saying, very much in line with what Mauro has been saying, is as we know we are going to have massive injections of money into rebuilding our economies, let's make sure that that's lined up with the clean, resilient jobs that we need to create. I just want to give you 4 very simple examples of those kind of signals and some of the ways that governments are responding. The Energy Transitions Commission, it's a group of about 40 CEOs of energy and materials companies. So those you might think would be historically maybe not so keen on accelerating. They've just published a paper which includes recommendations to really speed things up, including recommending the phasing out of combustion engines by 2030. The French government's had a really interesting condition attached to its support to Air France of demanding a reduction, very significant reduction in emissions per passenger kilometre, and also a ramping up of the introduction of sustainable aviation fuel. We know that to decarbonise flying, we have to introduce sustainable aviation fuel. So some very intelligent policy responses. I'm glad to see Mauro mentioning retrofitting buildings. That's a great builder of value, improver of homes, so that the elderly are not suffering from cold in European winters, and of course it will put millions of people to work. And finally, some of you may have seen the government of Pakistan has been putting people unemployed as a result of COVID economic effects to work in planting trees, and we know that nature-based solutions are one of the key tasks to tackle climate change. But I wanted to end on a maths lesson, Nick, if you'll forgive me, and it's just to point to the way that we know that industrial transformation always happens exponentially. So please, everybody, be on the lookout for people saying silly things like, oh, we're only at 3% electric vehicles percentage of the market. The key metric is not the percentage right now, it's how fast it's doubling. If that number is doubling every 2 years, then you get from 3% to 100% in 10 years. You can do the maths. And actually, electric vehicle market shares are doubling much faster than 2 years around the world at the moment. So that exponential growth is the way that industrial transformation happens, has always happened. So please, let's learn the lessons of history and mathematics so we talk intelligently about the way that those industrial transformations are taking place and will take place in the next 10 years.
Nigel, thank you. You've got a question which you want to put, so if I can ask you to phrase it for us.
Yeah, so it's referring to my point about the accelerating rate of adoption of electric vehicles. So my question is to the audience, and you've got different time buckets to opt for. When do you think the world will produce its last car powered by a combustion engine?
And it's 2025 to 2030,
Yes,
2031 to 2035, 2036 to 2040, 2041 to 2045. So out there, a couple of thousand of you watching, please give us your view of when the last internal combustion engine fired car will be produced. And I'll come back to that in a moment, Nigel, then when we've got the outcome. Now, I've got to ask you the main question: when is COP26 going to happen? Because people have got to plan for this. Yeah. Whether you're a diplomat, whether you're a business leader, or one of the 90,000 who you expect in Glasgow at some point.
Yeah. So actually, I just need to correct Mauro, because it's not the UK government as the incoming president's decision of when the COP is postponed. The decision is made by a body which is a subset of countries in the multilateral system of the United Nations Climate Convention, called the COP Bureau. It consists of 11 representatives of the different groups of countries. So it's that group that decides, that made the decision to postpone for reasons that Mary.
You have an answer at the moment, Nigel?
We don't have an answer at the moment, but we know that there's been a lot of consultation in the last month since that decision, and the COP Bureau will be meeting in the next few weeks, I think. But so late May or early June, we will get an answer, and it will be somewhere between, I think, May and November in 2021. It's obviously quite complicated with juggling G7s, G20s, European Football Championships, which are taking place in Glasgow in June, for example, which tie up police. So, but we'll have clarity within a couple of weeks.
But as the climate action champion, are you concerned that the momentum has been dissipated, has somehow vaporized? I mean, many of us who were in Katowice and Madrid, it was kind of really disheartening, the level of foot dragging that went on in political circles.
Well, I mean, I think there's a degree of pragmatism about the extent to which the very real human and economic short-term crisis of coronavirus is occupying leaders' bandwidth. So, you know, and that's across, you know, if you're a mayor of a city or if you're a minister. So of course, a concern with the delay would be the loss of momentum. I mean, what I'm seeing from the communities and the people is a more of a sense of resolve that we must keep momentum going. And as I said, we're seeing more and more companies and cities and investors committing to net zero, and asking that governments match that ambition, because it's something that everybody has to do together.
So you're saying there's a mobilization which you can feel, particularly in public opinion, which is reflected in the politicians as well?
I think it's a bit too early to say whether it's reflected in the politicians. I think certainly amongst, I mean, we see the polling from the public. There's a very strong sense that we must have a clean recovery, and everything I'm hearing, I mean, whether it's from vehicle manufacturers or oil companies, there's a very strong understanding that the science is real. That's not going to go away, exactly as Mara was saying. And so we can't afford to dilute our ambition. My hope, actually, Nick, to be honest, is that the delay will allow us to get more organised and to raise more ambition that we would have been able to in a rush to November this year.
Let me ask you a question from Luke Ganachadya. The key words for action are transformation and ecological transition. COVID-19 has increased poverty and thus vulnerabilities to climate change in the developing world.
Yeah, I think as Mary referred to earlier, that's a fact, right? And one of the key threads of action on climate change is to tackle the issue of adaptation and resilience, which disproportionately affects women, actually, to Mary's earlier point, and the global south, but also, of course, affects communities. You know, in the UK, we've seen fires in California and Australia and floods in the UK. So, you know, this issue of adaptation, something that affects everybody. I think I've been pleased to see the UK government put adaptation and resilience and finance as two of the 5 themes that the presidency is driving in the run to COP26. So, but as Luca says, that's not going to be made easier by COVID. And so one thing that the international community, I think, is going to have to work very hard on is to avoid a kind of retrenchment into looking after ourselves, country by country, and forgetting that this issue of resiliency is global. It's certainly something that businesses are very aware of, right? Because multinational businesses rely on supply chains that are producing commodities or producing components all over the world. So we can't afford to have an asymmetric recovery in that sense.
All right, Nigel, one quick question which has just come in, and before we just go to the answers to your question you put, which has now just disappeared. Where is it? Someone's just taken it away. Here we are. It's either from Hannah Pierce or Cedric Knight, but they've got the same question, which is, are you confident the race to net zero, as you call it, won't simply be destroyed by short-term political decisions driven by the anger, alienation, and civil unrest that this could drive? Quickly, if you can.
I am confident, yes.
Thank you, Nigel. Okay, well, we'll come back to you in a moment. Let's now look at the questions that you put. Well, quite a pretty even distribution apart from 2025 to 2030. When do you think the world will produce its last car powered by a combustion engine? It's really equal.
But
2031. Nigel.
Yes, well, fascinating, the little experiment. But look, 75% believe it will be before 2040. So what's stopping transport ministers all around the world committing to, say, 2035 or earlier? I mean, as we know, the UK have moved their date to somewhere between 2032 and 2035. Scotland have already said 2032. Some countries have said 2030. So that's great news. We know the first vehicle manufacturers, Mercedes, have said 2039, Volvo 2040. So the 27%, I'd ask that you brush up on your exponential maths, and the 75%, tell your car dealer, if you know one, that you'll never buy an internal combustion engine again, and tell transport ministers that if they want manufacturing jobs in the automotive sector, they need to be pivoting to electric transport as soon as possible.
Well, as we know, certainly here in the UK, 97% of car sales have dropped, disappeared, and VW have stopped production because they can't sell any cars at the moment. That's 2 weeks after they restarted following COVID-19.
But interesting, Nick, if you look at the market share during the crisis, there's been a significant boost to the market share of electric vehicles. So although the overall volume is going down a lot, and that's something we see consistently, that even when markets go down, the share of electric vehicles goes up. So and most experts expect the crossover point in terms of cost to be around about 2022, 2023, 2024. So from then it's hard to believe. So I'd be in the 2025 to 2030 camp myself.
All right,
we'll have to
remember
wait
that.
a few years. We'll have
That's
to wait a few years.
the
Yeah.
champion. All right, Nigel, for the moment, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Stick around, please. Let's go to Chris Stark, Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which last week wrote a very tough letter to the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and also a separate, parallel, identical letter to the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Chris, you're joining us from Glasgow. So welcome, 4 minutes for you, and please keep the questions coming in.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to all the previous speakers. It's really great to hear the discussion, because obviously I agree firmly with all the things that we've heard so far. I thought I would just reflect on what a difference a year makes in this discussion. A year ago, those of you who are in the UK may know that the Committee on Climate Change, the organisation that I lead, is the independent advisor to the government on climate change. And we advised last year that we should set a new target in the UK of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And my intention had been that this year we would turn our thoughts to making sure that we get on track to achieving that goal, and especially over the 2030s. All framed, of course, by the fact that in my hometown, where I'm speaking to you today, there would be the COP in November. Now, all of that has been swept aside, at least in theory, by COVID and the coronavirus situation, and the story has changed. And that's now posing all sorts of questions, which I'm sure we'll want to talk about how well prepared we are for those kind of risks, and whether we are still in the right place, and whether that target is still the right target. I think it's worth considering the outlook for the short, the medium, and the long term, and I thought I might do that in my opening discussion, and maybe do that in reverse order. So let's start with the long term. And it's just fascinating to me that in the long term, nothing very much has changed at all. So emissions this year, even with this enormous global moment, may fall, I don't know, maximum 10%. I mean, it could be more than that, but it's maybe 5 to 10% would be my guess. But concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere still go up. So we are still, the proverbial tap is still filling the proverbial bath. And those concentrations of carbon dioxide are higher than they've been for 2 or 3 million years. 2 or 3 million years ago, sea levels were probably 20 meters higher than they are today. So we are still changing the climate. We still have a crisis to deal with, and we still need, therefore, globally to get to net zero. That's a scientific goal. I would say it's also an economic imperative, just as Nigel has talked about. And for me, there's some reassurance in that. There is some reassurance in knowing that we have to get transport emissions globally to zero. We have to get the power sector to zero as quickly as possible, especially by phasing out coal. We have to do something, especially in countries like Scotland and the UK, about the built environment and the building stock, making that more energy efficient. And we have to change land use and agriculture with it. And for me, you know, nothing really has changed about that. There is a great deal of security and reassurance in thinking about those things. And what we know about those things is that we know how to get to that global goal of net zero by getting those sectoral emissions down. We know that the cost is plummeting of the technologies and the behavior changes that would drive that. And the conditions are still ripe for enormous disruption to bring that about. And I fully agree with what Nigel talked about the capacity for that to happen quickly. So there's a pro-growth story about that is so valid as we think about what's happening right now in terms of the economy. But that's the long term. And in the long term, nothing much has changed. The medium term is absolutely fascinating. You'll see the question I've asked is about that, because there's so many questions now that we need to have answered about, crucially, what will stick, what will change after the kind of change that we've seen enforced upon us in the recent months. I'm fascinated to know what the audience thinks about that. But things like oil price, whether we have an enduring low oil price, what impact that might have, for example, on the outlook for investment if you're an oil company. Capital availability, are we going to see a change to that? How might industries be transitioning even more quickly, potentially, to a different kind of future in the midst of this crisis, and with that, jobs? And that question of behavior change that I've been talking about. Especially, are we going to see a new pattern of work? So remote working, is that going to be something to transport emissions and our willingness to fly if we have enduring social distancing? Perhaps the biggest question of all is what we're going to see happen to global cooperation coming out of all this. So all of this it seems to be very uncertain. And this year, I have to, in the work that we do in my organization, kind of process that. And then lastly, let's come on to the short term. And actually, in the short term, there's a great deal of certainty what needs to happen. We face, if I might put it this way, a moment of maximum jeopardy coming now for the climate, coming up. Do we turn away now conclusively from fossil fuels globally, here in the UK, right across Europe? and lock in, if I can put it that way, a genuinely low carbon future? Or do we repeat the mistakes of previous recessions, especially the last recession, and lock in instead higher emissions and fossil fuel use? And if we do that, then I'm afraid the goals of Paris are going to start to look very, very difficult, because in infrastructure terms, locking those things in now with pro fossil fuel decisions is going to be hard to reverse from. And really, this is the moment, I suppose, to try and change that story. And just as you said, Nick, we wrote to the Prime Minister just last week about that very issue, to set out some principles that might help steer us through that recovery. And I won't go through them all in detail, but I'll try and give you the highlights. And the first of those principles is the most obvious one, which is that we must use climate investments, those investments that will help climate change and address climate change, as a means to support the economic recovery and as a means to create new employment. Secondly, we must not lock in high emissions or indeed increase climate risk in those investment decisions. Let's emphasize what we can that is positive from the lockdown that we are in at the moment. That is, can we help those pro-climate lifestyle choices coming out of this, behaviors to change? Can we make it easier, for example, to work remotely? Should we be investing in roads when we could be investing in things like broadband infrastructure instead to aid some of those changes? And let's use tax now to strengthen the incentives for emission reduction. We know we're going to have to right the ship when it comes to the public finances. And it's now the time to think about carbon taxation as a means to do that, to drive us not just to a better public finance position, but also away from fossil fuels. And lastly, can we embed fairness in the steps that we take coming out of this? We know that existing inequalities have been exacerbated by the coronavirus crisis. Let's think about this in the round. We already knew we had a just transition to try and engineer. Let's think about the policies that will get us to a fairer outcome at the end of that. And emerging from that, a number of policy questions and priorities emerge, which I won't go through today, but they're obvious, and your audience will know what they are. And the last thing I'll say is that we still have COP26 in Glasgow to look forward to. The timing of that is much better from my perspective. I want that to be a huge success. And of course, riding alongside all these climate objectives is the more general question of, can we engineer better global cooperation? So for the UK and the presidency of the COP next year, that story of the need for domestic ambition on climate change, giving the right and the legitimacy to be a strong president of the COP, it matters more now than ever that happens. And of course, the UK is in the presidency of the G7 as well. And our partners for the COP, Italy, have G20 presidency. So climate change is going to run right the way through all of these global cooperation questions. And I really, really hope that the year ahead, and you said 18 months ahead, is a moment when we address that maximum jeopardy and put ourselves on the right track.
All right, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Hope is not a strategy, of course, but let me pick up, if I can, and ask you to ask your question so that we can see what the outcome is from the question you want to put, please.
Yeah, my question, which I'm sure will appear in a second, is very simply, do you think we will see lifestyle changes coming out of this that are pro-climate after the coronavirus lockdown, and to what degree?
Yeah, the options, Chris, are totally, considerably, partly, older habits die hard, return to business as usual. Do you think we'll see lifestyle changes in a pro-climate way after the coronavirus lockdown? And that leads me on to one question to you, point 5 in the document that you sent to the British Prime Minister. This is not about being Britocentric, but you've been putting pressure on a leading government to ensure the recovery does not lock in greenhouse gas emissions or increase climate risk. Every government should be faced with exactly that. Do you believe you will get traction on that?
I think in the UK we will. So I have to say I'm very heartened by the kind of discussions that we've been having with the government here, and governments, I should say, of the UK. I mean, we have the 4 nations of the UK too, who have very important decisions ahead of them about how they engineer the recovery for the UK. I think that is also true of Europe. I'm not sure it is true in other countries, and I think that is something that we're going to have to confront. So the decisions that we take now will lock in a path for emissions into the future. I think in the UK we'll make the right decisions, at least that's the noises I'm seeing. So, and one of the reasons for that is that we're well prepped for it. We had a momentum prior to COVID to actually putting together a genuinely ambitious package of policies in the UK that would lead us closer, at least, or put us on track for net zero. That was interrupted by COVID, and I would say interrupted by the UK's general election. We are ready for that now. We have an infrastructure plan on the stocks that we can get going quickly coming out of this.
Well, Mary Mauro and Nigel, I'd like your answer on that kind of thing, whether ensuring that recovery does not lock in greenhouse gas emissions or increase climate risk is going to be something which really has a momentum of its own. Chris, a question here from Hector Garcia from Lime Jump, which is a UK energy tech company. If we're to mobilize the financial resources needed for the massive changes required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then the globalized financial system must be subordinated to the need of nations and to the task of transformation. How is that achieved?
Well, it's not going to be easy, is it? I'm not sure I fully agree that it needs to be subordinated. It certainly can be shaped, and actually, again, there was momentum towards that too. Now, one thing that some of your audience may not know is that next year the Bank of England is going to conduct a climate stress test of the UK's financial system, and they're continuing to do that. So that what they'll be looking at there is using the TCFD rulebook, which is the rulebook for financial disclosure for climate risks. To test how prepared the UK financial system is for climate change and to understand how exposed it is to the transition to net zero. That kind of step is hugely important in revealing, I think, how capital flows will need to change in the future, and crucially revealing, I think, a straightforward financial disclosure of the extent of risk that some corporates face. I have a belief that will probably push capital to flow even more quickly towards these pro-climate, clean technologies and clean steps in every sector that we know we need to get to in net zero. And that's not just in the UK, that will be globally. So my own take on that is that we need to see more of a focus on appropriate regulation of the financial system to make sure that we reveal those risks and that capital flows to the right things. All
right, Chris, let's get your answer. Let's get the answers to the question that you put 3 or 4 minutes ago. So Reese, if we can have that. Here we are. Do you think we'll see lifestyle changes in a pro-climate way after the coronavirus lockdown? Multiple choice. Emphasis here on partly. More than half, just over half, think that we will see lifestyle changes. But it's moving in that direction, Chris and all of you, towards totally and considerably. In other words, the top 3 lines are really important, suggesting that 90%, 80% are moving in that direction. There will be significant lifestyle changes. Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Chris, for those remarks. Let's now open it up for the last 20 minutes. As we promised, we've got an enormous number of questions. I'm going to try and build together whatever I can. Now, there are 2 or 3 people who've actually written to us, I have to say, suggesting that they are one of those who voted yes about the durability of fossil-based energy. Let me read one. I think it's from James Lee Murphy. I'm one of those who voted yes, because I believe it's unrealistic to suggest that we can move away from fossil fuels on a time frame normally associated with the term rebuild, as that term is used after a crisis. There are a couple more like that. Mary, I'm wondering what you would say to that, and also Nigel and Mauro. In other words, that question has been put. There are 11% of those watching saying, actually, there's a future, and Mauro said very clearly he believes in all views being heard. What's your view on that, Mary, that there are still those who believe fossil fuels have a critical role?
I think it's really important that this time we recognize that there is only one way to go, because we have 2 crises. We had a looming climate crisis, and we were taking steps, and we've got to be true to those steps, as each of the panelists has been emphasizing. But it's not necessarily happening. To answer another question you asked us to think about, Nick, I'm worried about what's happening at 2 big countries. China is coming out of this more quickly because it's dealt with the crisis more quickly internally. Maybe we didn't all agree with all the things and etc., but it dealt with the crisis and is now moving out of crisis and building more coal plants. That's really sad. That's a really regrettable, and I hope China will think about it, because it's all about leadership. The United States is thinking of bonds for fossil fuel companies, 750 billion in bonds. That is not the way to come out of this crisis.
What do you think, Mauro? You asked, you saw 11% answered your question, believing that there's still a future for fossil fuels. And you heard just one of several, I have to say, who've said that. I encourage them to write in.
I was actually hunting for those answers, for those questions. And the fossil fuels is easier and faster is a common one. Yeah, but look, that's not the point. You know, nobody is wiping out fossil fuel-based energy generation tomorrow. The question is, as we exit from the crisis, are we going to invest, are we going to subsidize the uptake of the combustion car market or the electric car market? Are we going to invest our next generation of power generation into coal, oil, or into renewables? The transition isn't going to happen overnight. In Europe, we'll need probably between 20 and 30 years to get rid of fossil fuels completely. But the question is, do we use the money for the recovery to lock in more fossil fuel-based assets, which we'll have to get rid of later, or do we stop that nonsense and start invest? Yeah, it is true. Fossil fuels are more flexible, so is nuclear for that matter. On the other hand, 5 years ago, we heard that renewables were a disaster, 10% penetration, the system would collapse. In Europe, we're at 23% renewables. We have a compulsory target of 32% for 2030. Nobody's complaining. Of course, we have an issue on flexibility and we have to fix it. But we have the time to do it if we start and invest now instead of investing in the wrong direction.
Nigel, your view?
It's not an overnight miracle.
Well, I'd say, you know, obviously very, very aligned. I think the key for me is, again, even if there is an inevitability about these transitions, the UN principles of responsible investment have just done some research, and they actually model what they call the inevitable policy response. As I say, the science is getting clearer and more worrying. Citizens are getting more worried and more demanding, and the economics is going in the direction of the clean solutions. So with regard to the power system, the Energy Transitions Commission published their report Mission Possible about 18 months ago, which very clearly shows the clean pathways to eliminating emissions in all the heavy emitting sectors. And very importantly, this issue of flexibility in the renewables power system is, we know the solution, it's storage, whether that's batteries or hydrogen. And so investing in the hydrogen economy is the sort of thing which governments should be doing as they come out of this COVID recession, because that's going to be building the competitive job space of the future. Anybody investing in coal is not saving jobs or creating jobs in the future. Actually, they're destroying jobs in the future by investing in the past.
There are quite a few questions, and I'm going to pick one which reflects several of the questions we got here from Tene Ekundare. Given the results of the survey, how do we make sure, he's from the FAIR Initiative, how do we make sure that people don't get fatigued by helping humanity through COVID inequality and keep that galvanizing force to help through climate inequality? I mean, that really encompasses so much of what all four of you have already said. Mary?
I think it's not a question of fatigue. It's a question of, we actually have needed an empathy in our world for the situation in which we were in with this climate crisis. The children were begging us to help them to have a future. Millions of them coming out under Greta Thunberg, and we weren't listening properly. We weren't listening to the science properly. We needed the empathy, which we now have, of a very stark situation, which has brought us back to basics. We're in our homes now. We're with our families. We're kind of back to, and we know that countries need good health systems, good education systems, resilience for the future. And I don't think that will change or be fatigued. I think it will grow. I hope it will grow, because that is what we need. It's there in the 2030 agenda on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind. That's a wonderful way of approaching, reaching resilience and sustainability.
Chris, given what you wrote to two prime ministers or first ministers last week, do you see this as a vulnerability for the case?
No, far from it. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Mary has just said. I think the answer to this particular conundrum is that we need to come out of this in a way that is pro climate, but in a way that also binds us together. And all of the things that on this discussion, you can hear the speakers advocating will do that. So I do think this has been a moment of reflection for us all, of course, and we are appreciating simple things like, you know, local amenities, our families, what is around us, green spaces in cities. We will come out of this, I strongly believe, having a different outlook. And it turns out that the things that we'll need to do to rebuild our economy are also the best things are the things that will also drive us to the new economy in the future. So we shouldn't be ashamed of tackling climate change as we come out of this, and in doing so in a way that binds us together and our communities together.
There are a lot of technical questions here. Let me give you just a sample. This from Ronnie Ginat from Israel. For Nigel and Mauro, as the transport sector poses a serious climate problem, what measures are being discussed for reducing emissions from heavy-duty vehicle road transport besides electrification? And another one from Ana Batista, how can regions and countries deal with losing competitiveness by enforcing a carbon tax? You can see the kind of granularity we're getting here, much of which we can't fully reflect. I apologize, but Nigel, first of all.
Well, maybe I'll take the heavy vehicles one, as I spent 5 years of my life in industry running a factory making brake pads for trucks. So I know the industry from the inside. I think I mentioned this Mission Possible report, which Energy Transition Commission put out a couple of years ago, shows a pathway. At the moment, we're in an early stage of transition when the technology hasn't necessarily settled. So there's still an argument about batteries versus fuel cells, about gas as a possible interim source, and about catenary wires. But I look at where the money's going, and recently Mercedes, who are the biggest truck manufacturer in the world, and Volvo, between them, I think they have about a third of the market in Europe. They've just entered into a partnership and committed to fuel cells. So I think we can be pretty confident that, and Daimler, by the way, have also committed to net zero trucks by 2039 in Europe and North America and Japan. So I think we can be pretty confident that we're going to see heavy trucks go down the fuel cell route, whereas the lighter delivery trucks are probably going to be battery operated.
Mauro, do you want to add something on that? Because it's technically critical.
I totally share Nigel's analysis. But the fact is that we have started regulating in Europe heavy-duty trucks. We have now set stringent standards for trucks, with the first set entering into force in 2025, and then in 2030. And this on passenger cars is driving the transformation, and will drive the transformation in trucks as well. So road transport is on the right track. The question is, we now have an opportunity to accelerate, because we are going to subsidize the uptake of the market again, because this is an industry that employs 14 million people in Europe. We can't let it collapse. Now, if we do it in the right way, the kind of mathematical progression that Nigel was giving us is going to accelerate. It's a fantastic opportunity. And I'm just out of a discussion with my boss and the CEOs of the car industry, and that's what they're asking for. They're not asking us to go back to subsidizing combustion cars. They're telling us, how do we move forward? People want to make money. We live in a market economy. We have to keep it up, but we have to change it. You know, if we don't give people jobs, prosperity, a prospect, they will not support the climate transformation either, no matter how much they would like to. You know, there was a slogan in the Gilets Jaunes protest, which says, you know, if you put the end of the world faced with the end of the month, it's the end of the month that wins. It's absolutely right. What we can avoid, and we must avoid that.
There's a question here from Akash Gonka about how this can be done voluntarily, or does it have to be done by those running governments? Can climate action be achieved without changing from a voluntary agreement mechanism to strong and binding agreements to participate? That's a core kind of principle. All four of you. Mary, first of all.
I think we do need policies that bring us to the right place. Government policies, commitments by corporations, as we've seen, the race to net zero, the corporations take that decision and also do it in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the basic, protection of human rights in that context. The need to have fiscal policy. I mean, I've also spoken to Mark Carney recently, and it's very good to see how he's so clear on if we can build in fiscal policy that embeds a commitment to net zero, then that will move things very. So it's not just government regulations, it's also industry and finance.
Mark Carney is very impressive on this. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the UN process, of course, is the product of an international consensus. So I think it's difficult to envisage that the UN process could mandate the kind of steps that we might need. But I suppose I want to disagree with the premise of the question. That is sort of implicit in that question is this idea that there's some penalty in achieving, the goals of Paris. Actually, that's not true. If it's framed in the right way with the kind of right global transition, this is going to be a positive thing for the economy overall, and even over the course of that transition. And it's those economies that grab that and make the most of it that will benefit most. So I don't really see it as in some sense as the need to sort of drag people along with something that will be a harm. I think the steps that are necessary in those sectors I talked about in my talk are absolutely the right things to be doing for the benefit of the environment, but also for the benefit of economies globally. And the minute we work that out, the quicker this will go.
Mauro, I mean, you've got the Green Deal now. Are you having to drag people, or are people being mobilized on this?
People are very mobilized. The Green Deal wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had 15 years old people in the streets of Europe. These people will vote at the next elections. It becomes very real for politicians, even those who weren't convinced before. And I think we have the consensus in Europe, and that's what gives us the ability to create a model with which we can persuade others. At the end of the day, the Paris Agreement does oblige us to set up domestic policies. The question is, can we sustain those domestic policies? And we need political support for that. In Europe, we have it, and we have the chance to create a unique experiment of a policy that leads to a climate neutral economy and a prosperous one. If we don't succeed, we're all cooked. If we succeed, we offer a model for others to follow.
Let me bring this, we're almost at the end, but let me bring this back to COP26. It is about the road to COP26. And I'm trying to encapsulate several questions here, and I'm sorry I can't ask them all individually, but about the expectations, about how much more maybe needs to be introduced into COP26, about how you take the public with you, how you take leadership with you, how you mobilize leadership, how leadership is going to be changed by COVID-19. I would like to get your final reflections, please, about whether the cliff facing COP26, Nigel, I'm going to come to you last, the cliff facing COP26 is even greater than it was, or is actually now less than it was, simply because there's a realization of the planetary threat which has been created on COVID-19, which is going to be extended to climate change. Your final thought on this, Mary?
As I said, I was more worried in January than I am now, even though I recognize how destructive and terrible COVID-19 is in people's lives, in their livelihoods, in the health, and etc., and the inequalities of it. Still, it has changed everything, and we needed to change. I would never have wished a COVID-19 on anyone, but we can take it forward now, and I believe that the COP will be very different. I think there'll be a lot of real reflections. I really hope we can manage a COP that is very representative, and I was glad to hear Nigel say that. We need the different and diverse voices of climate justice.
Mary, I'm holding up your book again,
yes.
not just to publish it, to publicize it, but merely because you've got a lot of very personal stories in here, which has moved you on this. And how do people get involved in COP26, not just the delegations being sent by governments?
That's the important thing. Once the voices of grassroots and of indigenous really got heard in the delegates part of the COP, it really changed things. I saw it. I saw the difference it made to the technicians who were busy talking a scientific, technical language, and suddenly they were blown apart by the reality of frontline people building their resilience in their communities and talking about it. And that needs to be heard. And Indigenous peoples need to be heard with their wisdom of how to save the forests, etc. We need, you know, we need a very human-centered COP in Glasgow when next year. But also, I think we will see a difference in how people will think about it, and I think that will be more positive.
Chris, what kind of COP, quite apart from your city being overwhelmed perhaps by 90,000 people, what kind of COP do you think will be a success, rather than that kind of terrible feeling one got in Madrid and Katowice, that this was really a difficulty of herding cats?
Well, let me tell you, we Glaswegians put on a great show, so you're going to love it here. So when we come here, we're going to welcome you with open arms, and you're going to have a good time. So this is going to be a COP that has a really positive energy to it, and the reason for that is that we are in the foothills of an enormous disruption in the global economy that will lead us towards net zero globally. We maybe don't know that yet, but we are having a moment of reflection on some very big and important issues that I think will bring together, at least I hope, will bring together the communities of the world, and we can confront that kind of big disruption that is coming and be optimistic about it. So the good thing for me is that you're going to see, I hope, a COP in a city that wants it, in a country that wants it, address those really positive transitions that lie ahead of us in a way that we don't need to be afraid of it, because they're positive for the economy and they're positive for the environment. So I think that this will be the COP when I hope the penny drops and we realize that actually we shouldn't be worrying about these kind of mindless discussions of the rule book, and instead be focusing on the really positive set of transitions that are taking place right now in the global economy, which we need to harness and accelerate.
And Mauro, final thought. I mean, in the end, the Green Deal has moved very quickly, 100 days from the arrival of the new commission. What have you learned about the need to hear every single voice, or as many voices as possible, rather than the voices just of delegations who lobby you?
I think the function of the COP is to keep the pressure up. It doesn't, even after Madrid, we've seen a lot more action happening in country. Okay, in many places it's been stopped by the health crisis. But even with the health crisis, you hear a number of developing countries, the need and the wish and the request for help to restart that process. I think COPs are fundamental to avoid that governments forget that they get caught in the normality of business as usual. Their function is to show us that climate change isn't business as usual, and we shouldn't forget it. So whatever happens in the COP, the more noise it makes, the more people come in, the more people put forward the kind of message that Mary Robinson was talking about, the better off we are, because it stops us from going back into the routine.
Thank you, Mauro. Final thought, Nigel, because this is about representation from everyone, not just every government, but everyone. And there are many out there, and I can see from the list of people who've been filing questions, a number of NGOs and other organizations who want to have a voice as well. How can they have a voice, whether NGO, whether corporate, not just a government or an enormous organization you have to respect?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and one should be realistic about what actually happens at the COP. So as Chris alluded to, the official business of the COP is largely down to finishing off the negotiations of the Paris rulebook. And that's really important work. There's some really important things, but most of the work on ambition is done in national capitals and in boardrooms and investment committees and in cities all around the world. So ensuring that we have a COP which is inclusive, which, as Mary says, one of the reasons why the COP Bureau wanted to delay, because there's a fear that, for example, doing a virtual COP might be possible for us, but a lot of countries would feel that they would be excluded by doing that, and that honouring the inclusivity of the multilateral process is key. But for me, the key phrase is the road to COP26, because so much of the work needs to be done before we get to Glasgow. Countries need to raise up the ambition in their nationally determined plans at the end of this year. Some of them may spill over into next year because of losing capacity because of the crisis. Businesses need to step up, cities need to step up, and they are. And the more that they do that, the more that we'll get to that sense, that very clear sense of sectoral transformations feeling inevitable by the time that we get to the COP. So I think on that road to COP, it's also really important that we humanize the conversation. It sometimes feels very technical, and as Mary said, when it's a purely technical conversation, it's exciting if you're an engineer, but it's very difficult to engage in that if you're a frightened or frustrated 15-year-old. So I think we need to find a way to really harness all of that passion and energy to turn it into agency, so that, as I love the fact that Mara says that a 15-year-old on the street today is already a powerful political force, because everyone knows they're going to vote tomorrow. So I think harnessing that agency so that it puts pressure on businesses, on mayors, on investors and national governments, so that they all do their job as required by Paris of ratcheting their ambition. It's that road to COP that will allow us to have that celebration of ambition that Chris is inviting us to in Glasgow. And by the way, I think Chris knows this. I'm also a proud Glaswegian, although I lost my accent a long time ago. So really, likewise, looking forward to being in Glasgow and really celebrating the global community doing what it did in Paris. Actually, I mean, those of us who were in Paris, there was a really strong, palpable sense of we're actually doing what we're supposed to do together. We're coming together to look after the human family, and that's the promise of Glasgow that I know all of my fellow panelists and many millions around the world will be working on until we all see you in Scotland next year.
Thanks, Nigel. That keyword, humanize, that's formidable. It's like a Rubik's Cube. I mean, this is going to be extraordinary. Can I just ask each of you with one word answer? Do you think COP26 now can be a success? Mary?
Yes.
Chris?
Of course.
Mauro?
That's two words.
It can. Okay.
It's hyphenated, maybe.
and Nigel?
Absolutely.
You look at it with foreboding, literally what you've got to achieve.
Yeah.
But is it yes or no? Are you convinced it will be a success?
I am absolutely convinced it will be a success, and I look at it with foreboding. We have a daunting task ahead of us, and I'm convinced that there's millions of brilliant people working towards it. So I'm convinced that we will succeed.
And while you've been sitting there for the last hour and a half, you haven't come up with a date, have you?
No, as I said, the date will be agreed by the COP Bureau end of the month already.
If you had a WhatsApp message or something.
Nothing to share.
Nothing to share with us. Well, look, can I thank you all very much. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and Chair of the Elders. Mauro Petriccione, Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. Nigel Topping, the UK High-Level Climate Action Champion for COP26. And Chris Stark, who's the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change. Thank you all very much indeed. And this is about keeping a process going in the weeks and months coming up. So please see this as an important part of the process. Thank you very much indeed. My involvement in this is because we're doing a project about thinking the unthinkable. And that's what's happened now with COVID-19, what's happening with climate change, with many more existential threats. And that's what we identified. And we're delighted to be in partnership with Climate Action for the coming months. So see this as the next stage of a critical issue of how to keep the process going, building a community at this critical time. There'll be another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, which will be about the grid and which will be about other issues as well. And I'm looking for my piece of paper, which I can't immediately find. There it is, the grid flexibility. With it's going to be on the 2nd of June at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sponsored by Nodes, with Stathos Mokas, Rosin Quinn, Tavi Veskimaji, and Richard Sati. So please join us for that. This is part of the process, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and for 2,800 of you out there who've joined us and registered for this event. Thank you for watching for this latest in the route to COP26 from Climate Action. Bye-bye.